everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome all from far and near. Our lecture with new affiliates today takes place within the larger framework of the school's fall lecture series, Building Identities, which intends to highlight the idea that the construction of physical structures is inseparable from the construction of human identities. For these reasons, we are really excited to introduce our speakers for today, Ave Diamantopoulou and Jaffer Kolb of New Affiliates. Founded in 2016, NA is a New York-based design practice whose work emphasizes reuse for projects ranging from installations and pavilions to new construction. Through their works, which we are excited to learn more about today, Ave and Jaffer have described an interest in scavenging for parts to reconstruct fragments, surfaces, and forms out of byproducts, to find hidden moments of value and invent new visual languages and disciplinary tools. The firm's recent and ongoing projects, such as Drywall is Forever, a performance and installation for Performa 19, use discarded drywall pieces gathered from museums and galleries around the city to build a new white cube gallery. Roof Cuttings, a series of minimal structures that provide momentary shelter in New York City community gardens and are made of scavenged pieces of greenhouse sheathing. And Leonard Cohen, A Crack in Everything, which looked to the logics of disassembly in the context of the temporary exhibition as a site for material speculation. Alongside commissioned work, they additionally look to initiate projects such as garden testbeds and collaborations that focus on matters of reuse within the context of material excess, particularly as it relates to current standards of practice. For this work, they have sought collaborations with various branches of the New York City government, including the Departments of Sanitation and Parks and Recreation. Ave is a registered architect in New York and in Greece with over a decade of expertise in realizing built works. She has recently taught studio and theory courses at Syracuse, Princeton, and GSAP. She holds degrees in architecture and engineering from Princeton University and the University of Patras. Jaffer teaches both at GSAP and Yale and was the 2015 Muschenheim Fellow at the University of Michigan. He holds degrees from Princeton, the London School of Economics, and Wesleyan. In spring 2020, Ave and Jaffer were awarded the Architectural League Prize and New York's New Practices Award by the American Institute of Architects. With this, I offer you both a warm welcome on behalf of the Rice School of Architecture. I welcome our viewers to submit their questions and to stay with us for a candid conversation following the lecture. Welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for that generous introduction. Evie, are you going to start sharing? Yeah. Okay. I think we're good. So first off, good afternoon. We're super excited to be here and thankful. So thanks both to Liz and Dean Marjanovic for the invitation and everyone who was kind of responsible in bringing us here. We're happy to be here. I will say that we were very intrigued by the series prompt, by the kind of framework for the lecture series. This idea of intertwining building and identity to bring closer the kind of social and the former, to borrow the language of the brief. It resonated with us actually as a small practice that orients itself around issues of material reassembly, around imagined futures, around adaptation and reuse, that sort of forever inherits historical conditions in order to imagine a new life. And Evie, you can like flip through the slides. In order to imagine a new life teased out of or inserted into exhausted structures. So I think in a way, Liz, like you put a name on to something that we often think about, but maybe through slightly different language, and that's exciting. So we're new affiliates. I'm Jaffer and this is Evie, and I'll just start off and she'll pop in a second. We started 5 years ago, actually almost to the day. So I think in maybe a week or two is our 5th birthday, which is an exciting time. So maybe we'll just consider this our birthday party. Thank you for hosting it. We do a lot of different kinds of work, from product design to ground up buildings and everything in between. Thinking through past lectures on the topic of identity, we describe ourselves, I think, in a lot of ways. We described ourselves once as victims, or maybe of byproducts of New York City itself. We've described ourselves as necromancers, bringing to life zombies and other figures of the undead. We've described ourselves as designers, as preservationists, never as theorists, but maybe as thinkers to some degree, as insiders as well as outsiders to the profession of architecture, which makes me think maybe we're actually just really good at code switching and sort of performing different roles and sort of recasting ourselves based on whatever clothes we happen to be wearing that day. But either way, there's definitely a kind of issue or a question of identity, and us trying to sort of formulate and reformulate, the way in which we operate vis-a-vis the work and practice and design at large over and over again. So we'll look today at some projects that have equally, maybe we could call them mutable identities, that push up against a point of origin and that speculate on possible futures. So we called this talk Present, Past, Future Perfect, because we're always thinking about sort of simultaneous timelines in architecture, a future that references a past that doesn't yet exist, pasts that just happened, and the very idea of a present as a utopia that we're always in, but that disappears the moment that we look at it, that we name it, or that we try and engage it. In other words, for us, identity has everything to do with what we think of as duration or time, with performance and dynamics. And hopefully all of this abstraction will be illustrated by the projects we're going to share today. I think we're walking through 5 or 6 things, and we will try our best to stay on time. But thank you again for joining us, for having us. We're super excited to engage the brief and the audience at Rice.
I'll echo the thanks and say hello, and maybe just dive into the work and look to illustrate the introduction Jaffer just offered. So we're starting with 2 building projects, both commissions to convert abandoned manufacturing units into art studios. They're located in East New York, just a few blocks apart from one another, and they've been done for the same owner. One actually on the left was completed a few years ago. The one on the right, we're just working through the design. They seem like a good place to start for one to situate our practice as a sort of prototypical New York endeavor. Just an intriguing place where adaptive reuse is normalized as this act of bending buildings to new versions of themselves, and at the same time, a set of buildings that we're very aware represents sort of new users in known conditions. We're in the edge of Brooklyn. We're very mindful of neighborhood that's changing, and the way in which we respond to it has been critical. So luckily, alongside a great client who's engaging with local conversations and is invested in community building, we start these 2 projects. With the first one, we're confronted with a long, skinny building. It's over 100 feet with over a century of being used and reused and misused. And in this many decades and lives that the building has previously held, we enjoy kind of seeing them inscribed on its surfaces and in the way it's getting us to want to know more about what has happened. So we start design from sort of 2 ends at once. On the one hand, getting to know the building, kind of unraveling its layers and its kind of Dedal-esque interiors that somehow compartmentalize this kind of massive overhauled structure. And from the other end, kind of develop a loose understanding of our program's relationship to the street and the shell, a little bit like a master plan. It was apparent design-wise that we wanted to attach studios to the windows for light and air over here in the front, and then keep circulation in the back and devise a way to interact with the relentless linear character of the building. From there, we wanted to bring the 2 together. So our 2018 kind of idea of how this building could lend its proportions to this new set of occupants gently responding to the moments of friction with the existing conditions we sought to preserve. From obsolete skylights to infrastructure or poking through the walls, we thought drawing conventions begin to fail us when we want to engage something with specificity. And partly that makes erasure a rather easy task, leading into the slippery slope of self-similarity and seemingly objective construction logics. So we loved making these drawings to highlight precisely that we did not wish to arrive and pretend this was a brand new building, but rather be aware that we're adding one iteration to many. This is also how we thought of the facades, where the info remains legible in the form of bricks. Perhaps you can see a little better in the pictures. And it's just at large, inside and outside, so it's new and sleek and clean, juxtaposed with the aging and the found. At the scale of the individual room, again, geared towards white box space that is somewhat also unprecious. Each one is shaped by these very negotiation drawings, and it's becoming a little different and contrasting what we think about as conversational and negotiated, or pre-existing, predetermined, and found. The second building, just very fast and a little bit information still, doubles in size and somehow wraps the same logic around, becoming even more introverted in its logics. Results in this donut-like plan with studios in the perimeter, again, defining this inward-looking figural void at the core. Here in the first floor, perhaps the most articulated space becomes this shared center, which then, as one goes further up from the street, kind of finds its way onto the windows. The facade today is a kind of point of departure and a space to negotiate, and also to learn from, in the way that the original building is cemented and carefully punctuated. There's something about the solidity of the building that felt right to us, and the other way around, that understanding that the original kind of massively open character of the building already has become antithetical to its own structure. And ultimately, the design becomes this balancing act of letting light in and allowing some of the individual characters in the building to poke out, while bringing the two together on a layer that is subtly pushed inwards in order to delaminate kind of interventions over time. It's across both, because we keep finding ourselves answering the question, or attempting to answer the question, how much design can we afford and how much is it appropriate, or before the building becomes alienating, or quite simply but very seriously like this graffiti invitation. And in thinking about time in the context of this and the building's very present past, we're inclined to measure ourselves and only change it that much, as to preserve the way that those familiar with it continue to engage it.
So yeah, I think if the first couple projects outline sort of what we might call structures of familiarity that are embedded in the kind of fabric of the city that give us a sense of introversion, this next one is maybe a bit more a structure of exception. So this project, done in collaboration with the artist Rashad Newsom at the Park Avenue Armory, is planned for early, actually just a few months from now. It'll open in February of 2022. And getting to work with the Park Ave Armory, for those of you who don't know it, for us was a real dream. It's a massive space, you can go next, that began as a kind of military hall, an armory, that had this very particular function that over the last several decades has been co-opted and used as an art space. So this transition of one type of program to the other in an incredibly idiosyncratic, enormous building required us to kind of think about identity, just to go back to the kind of theme here, in a very direct way. Next. And to think through the kind of recent attempts at engaging a kind of formal dialogue between new interventions and existing material. In our case, however, it was maybe complicated one degree further. You can go next, by the collaboration with the artist. So Rashad Newsom, if you don't know his work, you should familiarize yourselves with it immediately. It's quite amazing. but it basically deals with cultures of Black queerness over the 20th century, specifically looking at things like the ballroom scene, voguing, and translating that into codified information. So in this case, artificial intelligence. Rashad is currently leading a research division at Stanford that basically programs AI to sort of perform an improvisational sort of queer aesthetics. And so for us, this kind of dialogue between the Park Ave Armory and that specific work was really a sort of exciting starting point. The other moment that was really great was when Rashad sort of asked us if we could look through this book with him and sort of allow the design to be inflected by some of the material contained therein. So we got really interested in African textiles, pattern making, systems, disruptions, fractals, all of these things that operate across many media and that kind of inflect everything from hair design to clothing to just kind of architectural geometry, et cetera. We also got really excited about the idea of spirals as well, which we sort of immediately began to translate into our plan. So you can go next. The plan for the overall intervention is basically two-part. The dotted outline is the armory itself. On the left is a sort of gallery cube. We wanted to stay sort of typological. So the gallery has 40-foot tall walls, which is crazy to think it's basically a 3 or 4 story building that we're putting in the armory. And it has this kind of coordinated spiral of these platforms, all of which are centered around a 25-foot tall hologram that's planted in the middle of the space. So the idea is that there's a kind of spiral-like circulation for visitors to engage the hologram from all sides. On the right side is a sort of theater space, an amphitheater. So the top part that you see in the plan is where spectators sit and the bottom is where the performers are. But for Rashad as an artist, it was really important to maintain a kind of bilateralism between the two spaces so that the kind of system of visuality between performer and audience was relatively equal. You can go next. This is showing the plan sort of situated in the armory itself. So you see how there's a friction between these semi-autonomous objects that sit in this kind of massive space. One of the things that we thought was really important in order to engage the armory was to not think of them as completely sealed off, but to actually relate them to the periphery. So we kind of eroded both the gallery and the theater so that when you're kind of in the space, there are all these cracks through which you always, reframe the building itself. This is a sort of axo view showing the two spaces side by side that are kind of full of this textile pattern that Rashad has designed. Next. And two sort of very quick views showing the kind of hologram in the middle on the bottom image and on the top the theater space. So for us, this kind of identity game of queering the armory felt like a really amazing way of both engaging in architectural material, but also revisiting what one can do in an existing architecture. And that's something that we've worked on a lot through some of our work with institutions. So now instead of presenting a project, maybe we'll just talk quickly about a museum itself. So this is the Jewish Museum. We're currently working on our 5th show with them. And this sort of like graphic novel style illustration, if you go back for a second, Evie, represents several of those exhibitions all happening simultaneously within the kind of shell of the museum. We're starting to think more and more that we're kind of like haunting the museum as ghosts, inserting ourselves in every crevice. Next. These are just 3 of the 5. I'll go a little bit further into one, but as you see, each plan and each kind of space strategy is completely different and autonomous. Next, which to us creates this kind of simultaneity. When we look at the kind of fixed plan of the structure of the museum and all of the work we've done in it, there's this kind of crazy sense of like different timescales operating at once. Next, which led us to get really interested in this idea of how the museum operates as a kind of organism, right? So this is a nerdy schedule looking at shows deinstalling and installing in the museum and realizing that over the course of a year or even 5 years or 10 years, the museum is just constantly in flux. It's constantly transforming, almost breathing at the rate of the shows going up and down, which we found really fascinating when thinking about the life of a building. Just to look at one show in particular, this is a show that we did after we'd done, I think 4 maybe different exhibitions. This is Leonard Cohen and Crack and Everything, which Liz mentioned in the introduction. This is an interesting show because basically we partnered with the Department of Sanitation in order to think about reuse in the context of exhibition design. But as a formal project, we thought this show was interesting because it operated on all 3 floors of the museum. And because there was a lot of kind of sound buffering that was needed, we had to kind of operate within the cavities of the walls and the ceilings. So we really felt like we were inserting ourselves throughout the museum in a very kind of like free way. These are just exhibition installation shots showing the material language, sound buffering materials like foam wall panels and rubber flooring. We wanted to create a kind of like contained aesthetic environment that felt specific to the show itself, which actually was more interesting when we got to the scale of highly articulated characterful galleries where we had to kind of like weave our design through like a pretty serious existing condition. But what's interesting here, you can skip to the next one, was thinking about the context of reuse. Sorry about the horn in the background. The context of reuse in exhibition design and our partnership with the Department of Sanitation. Next, what this allowed us to do is to actually work with the Jewish Museum to catalog all of the exhibition waste from 5 prior shows and start to rethink how we could intervene in that process. Next, in this case, basically doing a very serious post-occupancy and dialogue with the Department of Sanitation to make sure that everything that we used could find a second life after the show. This included, again, the rubber flooring, the acoustic foam panels, benches, subflooring, vitrines, seats, and even ceiling tiles. So for us, like finding new lives for everything while designing something was a kind of fun time experiment to understand how reuse could be anticipated. Next. These are a series of kind of diagrammatic renderings that we made with the museum in order to look at, foam being installed in a way that could be transitioned, vitrines moving between museums, a floor becoming a kind of new public space. And what was really exciting is at the end, almost everything except for the drywall itself was reused. And that was like a kind of, it was a successful experiment that happened just before COVID.
And just about at the same time as the Department of Sanitation was distributing Leonard Cohen's materials, the Arts Biennial Performer invited us to give a performance lecture. So we saw in this an opportunity to consider what performance might mean for our field. And we imagined that if we just moved further and further back from our individual projects and observe this just kind of massive network of work happening between us and our colleagues and peers and just like the world at large, we might start seeing products and byproducts extracted and deployed and tossed away, starting anew. And within this network, we wanted, coming out of Cohen and all of our drywall leftovers, we wanted to look at this one material in particular. Because come to think of it, it's rather unremarkable, but also just fascinatingly everywhere. It just can take on any character you assign to it, and regardless of what happens, it's always new and fresh and unbreakable and treatable. Except, when you see it piled up here in the recycling facility, and you begin to understand the magnitude of its kind of problematic circulation. So this is all taken in one of 2 reuse tribal reuse facilities in the Northeast, where essentially they collect clean scraps and turn them into agricultural products like animal bedding, or even just parts of it goes back into the board making industry. The thing with gypsum is that it's generally rather innocuous. You might find it in your toothpaste or food products. It's also just an ample resource, because we're not really at any risk of running out of gypsum anytime soon in terms of extraction. Where it becomes really problematic is when it ends up in a landfill within the context of mixed C&D construction and demolition waste. In other words, when put into anaerobic conditions, it transforms into these toxic chemicals, bringing back into nature. So we thought this is an ecological problem, obviously, but also a sort of a material identity issue that we could begin to take on. And we looked to devise a way to engage drywall that pushes against its pristine single-use ethos. And for that, we started by collecting small pieces from as many exhibitions as we could intersect with within like a given moment in time. I think it was just a month, November of 2019. So from galleries small to large-scale museum exhibits, we just called people up, looked up their closing dates, and tried to get a piece of their demolition waste. Those we looked to stitch together to, specifically push back on this idea of the pristine white cube, this kind of modernist ideology of displaying art and displaying work in this timeless, apolitical, iconist, kind of non-specific, completely shielded, anonymous space. And we thought that maybe there's a way to understand that the walls themselves that are being taken down, constructed, and reconstructed carry a narrative and a kind of provenance, and potentially even like a new kind of ornaments. So this was our sort of provisional sketch for how we might begin to puzzle things together. And for a couple of weeks, I'm not going to show the entire video, but for a couple of weeks or a few days, the two of us kind of engaged in this massive puzzle making, kind of stitching together different pieces of different thicknesses with kind of different leftovers from shows over time. Starting from just arrange everything and kind of thinking about massive seams, how to putty and join, erase, and at the same time preserve a little bit of the memory of the pieces that came together.
It was days. I'm just gonna say.
I am so bad. I know.
That'd be a dark moment to realize that took us weeks.
yeah. That is. It is wildly inefficient, I
think. Following on the Drywall Forever project, we recognized that we wanted to kind of engage in another kind of branch of material research, maybe paralleling that methodology. And just recently we were invited by Sarah Lawrence College to do an exhibition of our own work there. And we saw it as an excuse to kind of dive into another material. I think maybe because of the kind of collegiate environment of Sarah Lawrence, or maybe thinking about the upstate quarries, the ecology of upstate quarries, we decided to turn to granite and to sort of try and think through granite a little bit, maybe within a kind of similar, again, method or maybe framework as drywall. But of course, while equally ubiquitous, granite is also incredibly different from gypsum. I mean, it's heavy, it's immovable, it has a totally different kind of history within our discipline. And for us, it sort of began as a bit of a cultural question. So we called the show Granite and Rainbow, which borrows from Virginia Woolf, who famously paired the two together as a title of a series of essays in order to create a distinction between what she called the reality and the imagination, between hard facts and ephemeral dreams. And we really liked thinking about this project as kind of simultaneously a technological one, but also a kind of poetic cultural one, and to begin to kind of pick that apart. So you can go next. So coming from the Latin granum or grain, granite is a particular material because it starts as a kind of magma that works its way through different kind of like rock structures and picks up all of these sort of I don't know, ephemera, for lack of a better word, along the way that give it its kind of particularly messy, granular character that always feels like it has this kind of material richness because essentially it's obviously an aggregate, even though it's a stone. And we really liked that narrative in thinking through its possibilities in terms of kind of creating aesthetic environments. You can go next. For us, it was also a, are you switching? Is it sticking? There we go.
Yeah.
There's also this kind of amazing cultural narrative around granite where it went from the kind of monumental, civic, grand scale, from large granite pavers to obelisks to the kind of base of the Statue of Liberty, for example, next through to things kind of as disparate as mailbox posts and graves. So there's this kind of amazing memento mori element to it. And then of course, sorry, we'll be flipping back and forth, but of course, the kind of scale of the domestic, when we look at the granite bathroom or the granite kitchen counter itself, the most kind of like proliferate use that speaks to a certain degree of like taste and cultural value. So the idea that this one material that has so much character, that has such a kind of material quality, could be used equally with equal facility as a tombstone and a kitchen counter and a monument and a neoclassical building felt like something that we wanted to kind of engage a little bit more and begin to understand. Next. For the actual exhibition at Sarah Lawrence, we chose 3 granite types. So we chose Milford pink granite, Woodbury gray granite, and Deer Isle granite, all of which come from the northeast of the US. And we looked both at kind of large scale buildings that were made out of them. So American Museum of Natural History, the courthouse or state house in Ohio, in Cleveland, and the JFK Memorial. And we looked at those just as kind of what they represented, and then zoomed in on some details of their construction, and then found products that you could buy made out of these 3 granite types. So on the left, the Milford pink, we found this kind of bathroom floor tile. For the Woodbury gray granite, we found these pavers that were used. There's actually a really interesting moment in the early 20th century, where New York City was trying to decide if all of its roads should be asphalt or granite. And there were all these like amazing debates hosted by the New York Times in the late 19th, early 20th century about which would be more appropriate. So we thought having these kind of civic pavers as products in the show would be really interesting. And then our favorite was this tiny 4-inch tall Deer Isle granite clock that we bought and installed in the gallery. So the scale shift between the building and the product felt really important to us somehow. Next. We paired this with a kind of speculative rereading of our own work. So we took 3 of our projects, 2 that were built, 1 that was a feasibility study, and we rendered them as kind of monolithic granite proposals, thinking through, the kind of relationship between form and shape and kind of stereotomy, and that kind of accumulated aggregated surface project. So granite as surface versus granite as monolith, as read through our own projects, just felt like a kind of fun way of thinking about the kind of technologies and the media of granite itself. Next. In the gallery space, we divided it. These are terrible installation shots. We have to figure out how to get this professionally photographed, but we sort of thought about this divided in 2. So on the one hand, as you see in the top left image, there was a kind of white half of the gallery where we displayed the products. We displayed these kind of photographs of the granites we were looking at. And on the left, you see this kind of blacked out space, which is where we showed large scale projections, not only of our projects, but also of kind of hundreds and hundreds of photographs of different granite types and different applications through kitchens and bathrooms primarily. Next, this research obviously coincides with a larger study on processes of material ecology, of excavation, of labor, of transportation and infrastructure, and material logistics. And this to us became a kind of really interesting way of thinking not just about the material itself, but thinking about something that's so heavy, that's so immovable, that has such a kind of like the history of its deployment is undisaggregable from its history as a kind of heavy, immobile thing. And there's a kind of elision there between the kind of proliferation of its implementation and the difficulty it is to kind of extract and mine it. We then looked at kind of present state of granite, products, and found a range of new possibilities, including these ultra thin stones that are down to 1 centimeter thick that makes a 4-by-8 foot slab of granite, which should actually now be called a sheet, equal to 2 sheets of drywall. So suddenly we started seeing where these systems could come together, and that felt like an interesting kind of design prompt for us to play with. This last image is like a very early kind of speculative design. This was not done for the exhibition, but was actually done after the fact, and thinking through how we could take a kind of infrastructural logics of granite and treat it as an architectural proposal. So in this case, thinking about a kind of dismantleable and movable set of these 1 centimeter granite panels that are built into kind of furnitures that can be treated as a new sort of domestic interior. So taking the kind of image that we might have of like a McKim and White building, and then the image that we have of a kitchen counter, and trying to combine them into a new hybrid of a kind of lightweight granite environment that may be light permeable, that might be movable and reassemblable, as a kind of new investigation into the possibilities that granite might offer.
I might actually just skip over this one to spend a little bit more time with testbeds, that is the following projects. So very quickly flipping through our architectural league exhibition um, to maybe continue the conversation somewhere at the intersection of granite and drywall, reuse and the politics of the cultural imaginary in this project that looks into assemblies in the space of a singular material. Specifically, we look at this very elaborate and often iconic assemblies that are mock-ups. As you may know already, in large-scale construction, it's typical to build a chunk of the building to test out its visual or its performance qualities before going ahead and making a massive super tall tower or whatnot, so a custom piece of architecture. And it's an exciting moment, and it's also a very fast one. This building excerpts represent a tremendous cost in labor, material, efforts, finance. They're often $200,000 or $300,000 at a time, and yet very fast they go from these iconic preludes to the building that's supposed to come to complete junk. And that hard and fast transformation was something that we found completely stunning. I should say, and this is the best audience to say this to, we've developed this project in collaboration with architecture historian and former Rice Fellow Sam Stuart Hallaby. And between the three of us, we kind of brainstormed in extending the lives of these structures through resituating them or reimagining them as casitas or greenhouses across New York's vast network of gardens. On the one hand, because it makes logical sense in a scalar, straightforward way. And on the other, because this idea of the mock-up becoming, representing an investment and becoming this kind of cross-city exchange token between tall skylines and down-to-the-earth communities seemed to us all too compelling. In a way, this becomes this, the kind of assembly becomes a dual resource, both as a material kind of gift and as an image or an ambassador or this urban bridge. So we began with this collection of sample mock-ups, just totally imaginary, gathered from the internet, and imagined them in new orientations and roles, trying to test out the limits of how much we can reorient them and just like really situate them in this new world of gardens and kind of open construction and just like ease and kind of transformability. And with those, we reached out to the New York Department of Parks and Recreation, who has since been our partner for the project. Shortly after, we were donated a mock-up coming from this condominium in Tribeca, 30 Warren, designed by post office architects. Parks paired us with this amazing garden that was just at the time getting started, pre-pandemic, out in Edgemere off of JFK. We worked together with the gardeners to imagine how this mock-up could become a cornerstone of this larger shading structure, which we see here on the site plan. So it's important to us that it's not all about the mock-up. The mock-up is the kind of instigator to respond to co-building with the participants. So in this case, the plan is made of 3 smaller structures: a community room, a shed, and a greenhouse, all housed under this larger roof or shading pavilion. All just sort of really stick out and kind of planned together with the team. In resituating the mock-up while giving it a new life, and I've seen it through the lens of its new material friends, the plastics and the 2x, or in this kind of conditions of informality and just in contrast to its maybe more strict Tribeca kind of counterpart. We've said this in every lecture the last few years. I'm gonna dare, and we're gonna dare to say it again. We're very close to getting this built after all twists and turns that we've all gone through the last years. We had our kind of initial construction meeting just a few weeks ago with the members of the garden, our construction team, and our team. This is Sam, who's not with us today. So we're hoping to really kind of complete this project. And more importantly, we're really interested in seeing this as a systemic kind of operation that builds upon not just the one mock-up and this one structure and one garden, but really as an infrastructure that works cyclically and continuously resituates, reorients, and re-engage these byproducts of fast construction, feeding this kind of forever need for open and accessible public space. Last project.
Yeah, so we thought we would close out with this project that we're calling the Sometimes Cabin. I think maybe prompted by this conversation around building identity. I think a lot of the projects that we showed today assume a certain degree of inherited material. So whether the mock-up or operating within an existing institution or in an existing warehouse building to make these new art studios, it always implies there's something there. And I think one thing that Evie and I try and think through a lot is, what one does, just with a kind of carte blanche as the kind of ground up idea, and can we still kind of test out these ideas about time and duration identity within the kind of context of a new build. So this cabin began as a kind of exploration of pre-engineered building systems and also an exploration of the context of rurality, like the rural outside the city. We began looking through old issues of Radical Fairy Digest and thinking about like back to land movements in the 1970s, which represented to us a kind of radical form of utopia that was both ideological, but also incredibly material in terms of their articulation and their development. So in this case, the idea of a sort of homestead that can grow and adapt over time, that folds in different kind of architectures, and that inherently is treated as something fungible and not something fixed. And I think that that particular context seemed really exciting to us. And the way that we sort of pursued the work was thinking about this typology that you see on the right, the pre-engineered steel building, which is actually an incredibly common type across the country. You can go and download one online, order it, build it. You can stay on that slide for a second, maybe. And build it very quickly. And it's actually displaced a lot of what we can do as architects and what we're asked to do as architects. And this is what you use to make a barn or an airport hangar or a shopping mall or whatever it is. And then to pair that with something that feels changeable. So we considered the pre-engineered steel frame a semi-fixed system, but then there's the kind of DIY. And this is actually quite related to the mock-ups project test beds that Evie just showed, but something that could actually be transformed by the people who are using it. All right, now you can go next. This led us to a lot of research on different types of cabins, buildings, farmhouses, barns. You see we even inserted ourselves in there in our big pile of gypsum, thinking through kind of loose issues of like reuse, aggregation, material systems that are coming together, different assemblies, mass production and customization. Next. Which actually was also instigated by a project we were working on. This was done right around the beginning of COVID, or the year before. It was a ecotourism site in Michigan on a flower farm that we were asked to design an event structure, like a 5,000 square foot event structure and 9 cabins for. Very upsettingly to us, this project was killed during the early days of COVID when its primary investor pulled back and never really reinvigorated it. But through those projects, we began investigating these systems of pre-engineered buildings that we thought we could adapt and kind of hack. That led us to worldwide steel buildings, the slide that we're on now, where actually we played around a lot with ordering different steel barns. And we taught a studio at Columbia, an option studio on this topic that was super fun, where the students are actually in communication with the company to kind of test the limits of pre-engineering. Next. So for us, the steel frame was really a starting point to think about what a semi-fixed structure could accommodate as a kind of movable mass underneath. So we engaged this series of studies that were about sort of like building on, under, above, and around these steel frames to create new kind of open courtyards, or next, different ways of having long corridors that were surrounded by built, space, things that pop up from the structure. We just treated it as a very loose design exercise that ended up actually reformulating itself, no, you can go forward, that reformulated itself as a kind of investigation into a housing type that we were being asked to consider during the pandemic, when everyone was kind of moving out of cities and moving to the country and wanted to build kind of cheap, fast things. So in this case, we thought about the steel frame as accommodating not just different formal configurations, but different thermal configurations as well. So in this case, you see on the far left, this kind of steel frame gets inserted with this tight pack of cellular rooms. So these are kind of like thick walls, heavy structure, an idea of kind of single occupancy. In the middle, you see a kind of a border building, the shell that's operated by a kind of loose open plan in the middle. And on the right, you see something that's actually open to the exterior. So it's going from like tight insularity to open interior to interior exterior hybridity. And so we saw all of this as being accommodated by the system of the steel frame, which is exciting to us. Next. This also lent itself to a kind of invention around material assembly and catalogs. So, you know, in this case, going from like a kind of heavier open space, next, to playing with sort of more industrial, easy to adapt systems that could be kind of uninstalled and reinstalled and moved over the course of, you know, several years, next, to something that felt more permanent and fixed. So in this case, like a mezzanine bedroom and 2 bedrooms underneath. Again, all thinking through different ways of kind of occupying that frame. Next up. So what came out of that research investigation is a project that is currently under construction, which we're calling, I guess, both sometimes cabinet or a structure in 3 speeds. In this case, we start with a kind of concrete pad and retaining wall. Next. And look at how that can accommodate this kind of plan that we think of as operating at several different timescales. So here we see the frame, the concrete, like a kind of wood structure and inhabitants, you know, kind of operating within that. Next. So just to kind of walk through it a little bit more, we see the kind of hybridity of the steel and the concrete as something that's slow or semi-permanent. So we think of this kind of base of the project as like a 50-year project, say. Next. And then the kind of wood frame building that gets built sort of underneath it, in this case, could be something that exists more at a kind of 5-10-year schedule. So the kind of interior walls and everything could be reconfigured. You could imagine actually popping out from under the steel canopy. And this presents a kind of lightness. In this case, you can see on the far left, these 3 tightly packed bedrooms, in the middle, this big open space, and on the far right, this idea of a kind of screened in outdoor porch. Next. And then actually, in addition to the 5-10-year plan, something that maybe exists more at the scale of a day or a week. So in this case, a tensile fabric, super skin that kind of covers the entire structure, which is in constant flux, activating this kind of outdoor enclosed space at the front that could be deployed very quickly. Next. Which we, I think, represent in this plan. So we're calling this our non-committal plan, basically creating a kind of super form over a fixed form that's constantly adaptable, done in these kind of canvas rolls that attach to fixed points in a grid on the ground in front of the structure itself. Next. We'll end with just a few in-progress shots of the installation and the construction. To us, what was really exciting was actually seeing the kind of steel frame and wood frames come together in sort of novel and various configurations. Next. And the sort of details of how one accommodates the other seems to be an endless game that we can play with. And we can sort of end there, I think.
Yeah, maybe just in closing, just point out that we kind of purposefully are framing this talk between 2 building projects, from the studios to the cabin, and bracketing other kinds of scalar or typological investigations in between, which is really just the way I think we practice and look to shape our ethos as designers. Like in many ways, the scale of the building is perhaps the most resistible one, the most seemingly permanent or methodologically fixed. And in looking closely to material logics or tropes of temporal projects, reuse and trapped networks or disciplinary baggage and cultural narrative, we keep an eye on bringing these back into buildings as to resist a bit being limited by our kind of known care for control, our meaning collectively ours, to explore instead what it means to be relational and open to adapting at large and through engagement, whether that is with actual matter, as it is in overbuilt Brooklyn, or in the case of just the Alpine Hills of the Northeast, just building culture. And of course, going back to the main question of the series today, and attempting to respond to it one last time, these do result in form, where form here is a product of friction, rendered apparent in maybe varying degrees each time. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Evie and Jaffer, for sharing present, past, future, perfect. It was really fantastic talk. I know that many of you are going to have to run off to studio, so I want to thank you for joining us over your lunchtime for this Zoom lecture. And I do want to encourage those of you that can stay with us for about 15 more minutes. We'd love to kind of reflect and chat about the work. I would like to start off just by taking on this idea that through the way in which you've titled the presentation, the present, past, future, perfect, you're really suggesting engaging this kind of theme of building identities through these concepts of time and performance. Throughout your projects, I was really kind of reflecting on this idea of like material performance, ecological performance, and this kind of sense of renewed identities. I think you also touch, interestingly, on these kinds of questions of architectural practice and the kind of techniques that also identify a kind of practice of the built, right? Like things like gypsum and its leaching into the landfill, the kind of techniques and timescales of temporary exhibitions, but also the kinds of like techniques of construction and how we build, and how those kinds of logics, like for example, with the last project that you showed in the studio that you're teaching at Columbia, how those kinds of identities of construction and building also in a way look back at architectural discourse and shape us and shape how we are able to take on projects, and the kinds of logics that we can either kind of choose to challenge or choose to advance or challenge in a kind of speculative way. I think there's also something really, I think the projects lie in a really interesting place between this like very earnest and commonsensical approach, and then this like radical speculation that I find to be a really interesting place for architecture to exist. And so maybe with those as some starting points of reflection, I want to open the floor up to our respondents and our who have very graciously accepted my invitation to join us for this Q&A panel. So first of all, I want to introduce Nathan Friedman, who is a Wortham Fellow here at Rice Architecture, and also directs a practice in Mexico City called Departamento del Distrito. We are also joined by Candela Cicinelli, who is an MArch student here at Rice School of Architecture, and John Carrillo, who is a sophomore here also at the School of Architecture. So thank you all for joining us. And for those of you that are able to stick with us on Zoom, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A function on the webinar, and I'll do my best to try to get to some of those. But if we're not able to get to your question, please feel free to email us, and we'll try to get you some response. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, our pleasure. I guess I'll just jump in. So thanks very much, Evie and Jaffer. I really, really enjoyed the lecture and the work and your framing. I think it's all really thoughtful and so beautifully represented. And I think I can speak for all of the young practitioners out there that just know how hard it is to kind of produce a practice that is really theoretically and materially engaged, and to do everything that you do in such a short amount of time. It's really impressive, and the work is excellent. So thank you for sharing it with us. I also appreciated the framing of the lecture about this idea of finding new lives or shifting identities, from that of your practice itself to the buildings, the materials, the occupants of your projects. So I think all of that is quite cohesive. So thank you for taking on also the brief in such a meaningful way. I think a lot of the students and the faculty here are really engaged with that conversation. It matters to us. And we're also searching for new avenues and ways to approach those questions of identity through design. Just seems essential for anyone operating today. And so I guess I'm most interested, particularly in terms of your practice and also the readings that you forwarded to us, about speaking about those identities that might be formed in the wild, to use the Halberstam framing. And of course, I think many other theorists come to mind that might frame that as queer or other or outside. And so my question for you would be, particularly in your practice, how do you carve out space for that? How do you maintain that space? And also specifically in relationship to some of those projects that you presented that are within a more normative institutional setting. I think those would be really some of the questions that I have and be interested to discuss with you.
Thank you for that really nice response, Liz, and Nate, also very overly generous. Liz, I actually wrote down earnest common sense and radical speculation, because I just think it's like a great, I love getting little moments like that. Nate, in answer to your question, I'll go briefly, and I'm sorry, Evie, I just jumped in because I had this like one thought that I didn't want to forget. But to me, the wilds is actually the normative work that you described. I think that we are, okay, look, there's like 20 million different versions of wilds, and like we could like track different desires and how they manifest in a kind of wilderness. But I think for us, the wilds are our practice, and it has to do with not putting the pressure on ourselves or every project to be theoretically interesting, or to be some kind of like thesis, or to be some kind of like amazing kind of like thing that's going to put us on some, theoretical map that does or doesn't exist. But it's really to say that like, actually we need to navigate the sort of like world in which architects occupy, space and practice, in order to kind of like discover or find new things that would actually be interesting, that actually give us a survival or survivor's toolkit. So for us, really early on, when we crafted the practice, we were like, you know what, like, we're not going to only try and like take quote unquote interesting work. We're going to say yes to everything. We're going to do every project, no matter how sort of like service oriented it is, versus how much we can like author some like genius, egocentric moments. And in the end, it's the kind of accumulation of all of those like normative projects that keep us going and that make us excited. And we've never wanted to kind of like craft to kind of extend the metaphor of the wilds. We've never wanted to kind of craft a kind of like Renaissance garden out of like known pieces that we like fragment into some kind of like occupiable space. Instead, we're much more interested in the kind of like unexpected and the unknown, which is where I tie it back to the wilds, of just kind of like going and like doing stuff without a kind of agenda, without a plan, without a thought, and just seeing where we end up and how we don't die, Like, I think that's like the problem with the wilds, is that you're basically just trying not to die. And I think in occupying that space, we've kept ourselves engaged, which like, I don't want to say that we've come up with anything great out of it, but like, I think that's what's really compelled us. And it feels really like, weird sometimes to have that attitude, but other times it's like, oh yeah, this is where we want to be. And I think that's the kind of naturalized space that we want to be in.
I think that maybe just one minor thing to add is just that, the thing with the wilds is, and like the Halberstam kind of takeaway is like, approach it with curiosity, right? Don't go to just like take it over and change it and just like interfere in it, but just like really genuinely, like exactly like we do with hyper normative practice, just show up and just like engage it at earnest. And so far we really have been doing that. I don't know, especially in the context of a very particular market that we find ourselves in New York City. You know, I'm sure, you know, practicing in Texas is a whole very different landscape of opportunities and pushbacks. But just like in the kind of fast, hard, and like overbuilt, intense kind of wilds of New York, just first and foremost, like at Ernest saying, yeah, we want to be part of this and figure the rest out has been really central.
Yeah, I would imagine a lot of it is also just the reality of being a young practice and like building things up step by step, right? And making the opportunities where you can and just like accepting the reality of the situation.
So Kende and John, I'd love to welcome your thoughts, and I'm really curious how you've understood the lecture and any kind of key moments to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the lecture. And every single project was absolutely beautiful and extremely intricate. And it was, I'm actually curious about how you, or I think it's extremely interesting that you've been able to create these quite radical, like new building identities just through the mediation of that material and building and architectural typology in terms of adaptive reuse. And so I was wondering if you'd be able to elaborate a little more on how you've been able to create this interconnected relationship of the material and the building, and how that also relates to then these different scales. And I know there are some projects that I was particularly interested in that I read about that you didn't mention in your lecture, like the perfume bottle. And so it's cool to see that there's this this relationship between scale and material. And so I was wondering if you'd be able to elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. This is a very thoughtful question and kind of touches on a lot at once. But maybe we could maybe start with the kind of very term of adaptive reuse and what this may mean and what kind of connotations it bears in practicing today. And that's something we touched upon in the lecture a little bit. But you know, there is an ethos of just like, I don't know, kind of erasure at large. Like when you like think of an adaptive reuse project, it's just really about how to like break it and like bring it into the kind of expectations that this new occupant or this new insertion, this new moment in time might kind of expect from it. And that, you know, it's a complicated question, and one that speaks back to just models of efficiency. It's just like it's so easy and hard and it's so easy and fast and kind of immediate to just, you know, like not engage with something, right? To just come with a preconceived notion of, oh yeah, here's how you build a wall, and here's how you know, make a partition, and here's how you layer things on top of one another, and just keep building upon like a forever palimpsest of ideas that like console like archaeologically or geologically almost one another. To us, like this is where maybe the material interest comes in, to just remind ourselves to slow down a little bit, to have the luxury in kind of physical and mental space to just really kind of look at things closely. And not pretend that, you know, we can put it again back to we're a young office, not pretend that this is our first like big break commission, but just see every one of these projects as a conversation with, you know, 10 other architects that have operated there and 10 different kind of construction logics that existed before our own. What was amazing in particular in East New York, in the first building, was that the more we unearthed materials, the more materials we came across that we hadn't, like you can actually timestamp. Like you can look at a brick and say, oh, this is like an early like 40s brick, because it like, you know, looks a little wonky, or like a 20s brick because it looks a little wonky, and each one of them is like a little different. And then as you go to the 90s, 2000s, like everything starts to look so similar and kind of well adjusted, and it's followed by the building. So I think, yeah. Just with reuse at large, I think it's the this idea of slowing down and kind of opening up. I'm not sure now how this helps with the perfume question. So feel free to lead us into the product design through this.
So once again, thank you so much. It was a really nice and clear presentation. And thank you for your time. I had a particular question about how do you determine which materials that you find qualify for adaptive reuse? Is there like a certain quality you look for in materials, or does it have a relationship between the reused material? And I know you said you don't you're exploring and maybe you don't know exactly where you're going to, but does it have a relationship towards like the end result, maybe?
Yeah, I'll probably, I already know I'm going to regret the beginning of this answer, so apologies in advance for that. But, you know, I think one of the things that we like about these adaptive reuse projects is that there's this kind of element of like improvisation. Like it almost feels like painting instead of designing a building and like erecting it, because you really, there's no like rule or logic. I mean, you know, there's a fundamental one, which is like, what's in good shape, what needs to be taken out, like what needs to be removed because it's like structurally unstable, and, you know, what clearly will hold up for another 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So like, you know, beyond the kind of like metric of like safety, you know, I think that the qualifications just vary so much in terms of like project to project. You know, there was that one drawing that Evie showed that I think we actually had in the beginning of the lecture of like that window that is in this kind of like white, kind of like jagged edged frame that kind of sits itself into a brick wall. And, you know, I think at that point we had this, I don't want to say fight, but conversation with our contractor, because he assumed that he was just going to take down that whole brick wall and then just like put like a nice new white drywall in and put this nice new window in it. And, you know, Evie and I were like, no, it's like, it's really nice as is. Like this will be easier and cheaper and faster. All you have to do is just like kind of scribe cut this thing around wherever the gaps are and like fill it in. And we really like that kind of moment. And those things really happen on site. And I think that one of the things that we really enjoy doing is doing like site visits for us are not about just like quality control. They're actually about like improvisation. And that's true for ground up buildings too. Another project we didn't show today is this house we did in Vermont, the Tunbridge winter cabin. And that was a ground up project, but a lot of the details that we worked on in that project were done on site with the contractor with a giant Sharpie drawing on the actual structure as it was being built. And then like eventually the substructure, like the, you know, the subflooring and the ply on the walls. And we would just be like, how about you do this thing over here? And I think that for us, like for better or for worse, that just seems to be how we design. And I think it's what makes us maybe gravitate towards these adaptive reuse projects, because it's just so improvisational. And it feels like architecture becomes more about performance and more about the body and like the body existing in space and like not trying to predict everything through a 90-page drawing set, that I think actually leads to the kind of like depiction of the architect as like fighting everyone all the time, because you're like, no, that's in my drawing set, I made these 90-page drawings. And it actually is not, it doesn't allow for kind of like relational reinvention as like the process feeds in on itself. It closes off the possibility of a feedback loop, right? And it makes everything predetermined and therefore ontologically deterministic. So I think for us, like these things all kind of tie together. You asked a very simple question. I think I went on a real tangent, but I think that's how we decide, you know, when we're on site, like what's worth working with. You know, everything is kind of like materially equal, and it just is like participating in a kind of organically evolving, I don't want to say vision because that sounds so pretentious, but like set of ideas that we have for a building.
If I can maybe start wrapping up our conversation, I'd love to just ask maybe a question that both tries to thread together some of the topics that we've talked about just now, but also that is a little bit more critical. And I think a question that I myself, and I think practitioners that deal in these smaller projects tackle? And I think these questions of scale and adaptive reuse, materiality are really intriguing and really important. For me, like I wasn't sure like where that desire, like the desire or like the value or like the meaning of using these existing materials. Like I know you mentioned like ecology briefly, and I think there's like an allusion to, for example, the problematics of drywall, like leaching, right? And so I'm wondering, one, like if there's a way for, because I think you're earnestly invested in these issues. And so like, what is the way in which us as like kind of emerging practitioners that have access to these smaller projects or installation work or like single buildings, like how do we start to think precisely of this question of scale? And for me, the drawing that really of yours that like really starts to suggest like a kind of really interesting possible future is this drawing that you've done of the Leonard Cohen materials, right? And how you like actually reached out to the people that are involved with the distribution of trash, and how like you've tried to embed yourself in these processes and cycles that are like beyond just like the scale of a piece of acoustic panel or beyond the scale of a single architecture exhibition. And so I'm just kind of like curious if you have a vision or an image, like where this might go in terms of the kind of impact that you see it having. And then, if there's just like any kind of particular issues of the world that like might have really led you to even ask these questions of adaptive reuse, right? Like I think there's like a jump to like adaptive reuse is like a good thing, but I think that there's more to it than that in the narrative. And I'm like curious to hear from you what led you there, and then also like where does it go? And I ask this because it's like a kind of question that I myself have and continue to kind of grapple with.
It's a really good question and much appreciated, Liz. Maybe I'll try to take I can think of answering in two scales, and maybe I'll take the sort of smaller one. And that would be the sort of scale of the assembly that we're very interested in. So in considering just materiality at large, the way it's available to us today, the way, the kind of like mega construction store catalog operates, there is a kind of one-wayness to it, right? If we take drywall, for example, just, reuse aside and kind of like the kind of lamenting the landfills, of course, like, also on the side, there is a logic to drywall where you take something that is made in sheets and then you try to pretend like it's this like continuous infinite surface by assigning labor to erasing the very details that make it, right? Like you have to just like go through it step by step. Sometimes it's 2 days and it feels like 2 weeks, but there is a logic to the material that comes from kind of manufacturing and industry standards that we collectively inherit. And whether it is, like a young firm here or like 100-year-old firm, it's just like, I don't know, the other corner of the world, we all just like deploy this material in a standard kind of way. And even if you think about like where these remnants come from and like just modernism, seamlessness, like all of these kind of ideas that we've moved past on from collectively in theory and in like writing and ideologically, then the moment we begin to materialize architecture, we just like bring them back away. It's like, oh yeah, of course, like it's gonna be drywall and it's gonna be seamless and we're gonna spend like, hours and hours just completely kind of following a 12-step manual of how this material is meant to be used. So theoretically, like I think there is a desire to just hack materials in a way that's is less specific to the one-off or to the like 12 pieces that we ended up inheriting. And that's where our desire to also like continue with granites or plastics, just like see how other materials may be open to like reinterpretation or reassembly or reconfiguration comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I know we want to wrap up, so I'll just be super quick and just say, maybe to tie us back to the very first point, my answer is much dumber than Evie's, but I'll just go for it anyway, which is that I think, look, we're not academics. We're not engaged in long-term research projects. We are really trying to just be a practice that has a lot of stuff always going on in the world at the same time. And, I think that is both a weakness, but in some cases a bit of a strength, in the sense that for example, that the reuse project that you're referring to with the Department of Sanitation, the Jewish Museum, I think I have a weird suspicion that if we had worked for 5 years trying to think through a completely theoretically perfect infrastructural map of how the exchange of material and flow could go, and then we kind of pitch that to the museum and the Department of Sanitation, they would just be like, what are you talking about? It would have been really worked out, but maybe a little bit overwrought at the same time. And that's by no means a critique on what people do in an academic context. It's more maybe knowing ourselves as two people. When we tend to overthink things, they tend to get very complicated, but actually dealing with those problems in the moment of a conversation and just saying, hey, we feel weird about this. We want to fold in the Department of Sanitation. Give us a minute. We're going to go email them. And then the Department of Sanitation is like, oh my God, yeah, yes. Let's talk about this. We want to think about it with you. And then you go back to the Jewish Museum and they say we don't mind if you critique the way that we've operated for decades, because now you're doing it as part of this bigger project. There's an organic, simple, direct quality to those exchanges that I think are absolutely enabled by being enmeshed in practice itself, and not trying to think totally systemically or systematically, for that matter, which I think can kind of create too big a chasm between the work that one wants to do and the work that one's able to do. And again, this is in no way, I'm sure anyone on this call could think of a million counterexamples, but I'm referring, I guess, to the way that Evie and I work as a practice. And I think that we're able to kind of do bigger systemic long vision work only through the act of producing and self-critiquing every step of the way, identifying the problems that we come up with. I mean, frankly, the drywall problem, I don't know that we ever would have thought about drywall if it weren't for the fact that we had done 7 exhibitions in a year between 4 institutions, and we just could not take seeing more of it come down and thrown in the dumpster. There's a moment where every time we'd enter a museum, we'd see one of our shows in the trash next to the, in the dumpster in the service entrance on our way in. And it's that kind of being on the ground in the trenches, working through the problems in real time, I think has given us a kind of broader vision that we're trying to work around now. So it's not a great answer to your question, Liz, but it's really just I think that there is a value, especially in, as long as you're able to kind of auto-critique constantly, which we do probably way more than we should. I think that you can do better systemic work just by doing work at all.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for reflecting on these questions and for joining us today. We have from Tess Clancy, just a thanks so much, Evie and Jaffer, ever inspiring, energizing, and enlightening. So just wanted to give you that really nice shout out. Thank you so much. So for all of those that are still with us, thank you again for joining us. And we'll be welcoming Philippe Bloch this Friday, November 5th via Zoom at noon as usual, and we hope to see you then. Until then, and again, thank you so much to Nathan, Kande, John for joining us, and thank you, Evie and Jaffer, again.
Yeah, thanks again, and it was great to meet Nate, Candela, and John as well. Thank you for your generative and generous responses.
Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you in real life soon.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
Evie
so
and
much.
Jaffer.
Yeah, take care. Bye.